migration. What is important about this project is that it focused primarily on the issues of the governance of migration. And in that sense, it is highly original. What Alan's team has been doing, but Alan will say much more about this going forward, is he and his team have been compiling in the initial stages just the basic facts of migration. Rather remarkably, there's a huge paucity of just basic information around the numbers of people moving, where they are moving. And what I found one of the highlights of this project so far, which is seeming so obvious and yet it seems to be so far from where the discourse is, that African migrants are not primarily moving to Europe. Indeed, the number of migrants moving to Europe from Africa is a tiny, tiny minority of all migrants on the continent. Overwhelmingly, migration is a phenomenon by Africans between and through African countries. And this is why the question of migration governance in and between African countries is so vitally important. I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to hand over to Alan. Alan, I'm going to introduce Alan, if I may. So Alan, barely needs an introduction. Alan Hirsch was born in Cape Town, educated at the University of Cape Town, Wits as well, and also Columbia. He was teaching at UCT when he was brought into the South African government, initially in trade and industry in 1995, so just after the democratic breakthrough. And then between 2002 and 2012, he managed economic policy in the South African presidency. He's currently the leader of the Migration Governance Reform Program at the New South Institute, and he serves on the board of the European Centre for Development Policy Management and on President Ramaphosa's Economic Advisory Council. So after Alan has spoken and given his presentation, he'll be joined by Michael Mutava, who's one of the authors of the main author of this report. Then Diego Utaralde, and I will introduce everyone as we go, as it's their turn to speak. And finally, Tsion Tadese Abebe. On that note, Alan, if I haven't too poorly introduced you, can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much, Ivor. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to share my presentation or if Raphael's sharing the presentation.
I can share it. Just a minute.
I don't mind doing it. Okay.
You can do it then.
Okay, let me try.
Okay.
I've disabled. I've been disabled here. Why don't you share it?
I will share. Just a minute.
Yeah. Okay, so Michael's paper is actually the second paper in our series. The first paper was a paper that I did mostly, but with the collaboration of my colleagues, who I will mention as we go along. Yeah, that's it. Let's go to the first slide. Okay, so I did a framework paper with the help of my colleagues, who I'll mention later, but Michael Mutava is one of them. Raphael Leiter, who is managing this webinar, is another. And the third is Victor Amadi, who may be joining us on this webinar as a participant as well. And I will introduce them in a little bit more detail later as we go along. But as Ivor said, the idea is to think about migration governance reform in Africa, finding paths for freer movement in a regular fashion rather than in an informal fashion between African countries, for Africans between African countries, and then for visitors between African countries as well. So the next slide, please. So the project as a whole, what are we trying to do? We're trying to identify promising, viable paths for freer movement in Africa. In other words, paths for reform. It's not necessarily the obvious path that is going to take you forward most consistently and for the longest period of time. So what's the way forward? Do we do as individual countries? Do we move as groups of countries? Do we move as a continent as a whole? Some combination thereof. What do we do first? Do we focus on all people or just visitors, short-term visitors? Do we look at business visitors? Do we look at low-skilled migrants who want jobs in other parts of the region? So there are a lot of questions about the viable paths, how are we going to move forward successfully? And in doing that, we need to consider the failure so far of the Free Movement of Persons Protocol, which was signed in 2018, so 5 years ago, and has had a very low level of support and ratification. On the other hand, unlike most other parts of the world, in Africa, there's been really significant movement forward at the unilateral level. Just recently, Kenya and Rwanda have announced that they're going to be visa-free for all Africans from the beginning of next year or by the end of this year. And that's just one element of the progress that we've made, which is very well documented in an annual report put out by the African Development Bank, the Visa Openness Index, which has shown consistent liberalization of borders since the first report came out in 2016. So Africa is moving in the right direction, even though the Continental Protocol hasn't been that successful yet. So we need to find ways to negotiate the obstacles, the ways over and round those obstacles. Now, we're focusing on governance, as Ivor pointed out, although we're aware that there are other obstacles to migration, such as the quality of infrastructure, the cost of traveling from one African country to another, the levels of income of Africans, which doesn't always allow them to travel easily, income inequality between countries, which may have an impact on travel between them as well, and many other factors. Okay, next slide. Why are we doing it? Well, I think it's widely accepted that in general, migration and development go hand in hand. Migration supports trade, supports investment, tourism, the exchange of services. In Africa, cultural exchange and understanding are very important between 55 countries on a huge continent. And for students and people who are making progress in their careers, the ability to move from one country to another and to accumulate experience is incredibly valuable. So the more we are able to do that, the more likely we are to be able to develop the continent. And yet we find that the literature is relatively thin. Most of the work is by consultants, and some of that is very, very good work, and international organizations. It's also often very, very good work, but they are constrained by their constituencies. So they're not entirely independent. They have a certain political framework in which they have to operate. We are independent. So this is independent work, which we hope will ultimately become maybe a series of academic articles or a book. But in the meantime, we're doing a series of papers which are entirely independent. A lot of the independent work is focused, as Ivor said, on humanitarian issues, not enough on governance. So that's why we're doing it. Next. Okay, so there's several lenses we're using. One is a comparative lens. How did migration happen in other parts of the world? We're looking at, well, we have looked at already, especially in my framework paper, what happened in Europe, what happened in South America, what happened in ASEAN, and we've learned some important things from them, really important things. I think they're really useful. I don't think each of those regions has followed an entirely different path, and that shows that paths are specific to context. But even then, we can learn certain things from them, which will come out, I think, as we go along. But one of them, for example, I don't want to go into a lot of detail now. We also think we can learn a lot from comparative African experiences. And I've the picture here is the 3 regional economic communities that we are focusing on: SADC, ECOWAS, and the East African Community, as well as the African Union itself. And then we're also looking at 4 African countries. We're looking at Nigeria and South Africa, and those reports will be coming out before the end of this year. And then we're looking at Mozambique and Kenya, and those will be coming out sometime during the course of next year. Thanks, Rafael. So that's the first lens, the comparative lens. Then we have a political economy lens. what's the political economy lens? Well, we ask questions of the material. In this particular country or region, who has an interest in reform? Who has an interest in progressive change? Who has an interest in protectionism? Who wants to maintain the status quo? How are the alliances for reform strengthened? How are blocking coalitions neutralized? Is there a way of winning them over? Is there a series of interim steps that you can take which will make the reform less threatening? So what is the sequence of the reform that will make progress and incur less opposition? So this is, again, when we talk about viable paths for reform, these are the kind of questions that we have to ask. Next. We also use a lot of empirical evidence. We use historical evidence about the political histories of countries, the key institutions, economic issues, demographic issues, and legal history, which is very important in obviously in all governance and in migration governance in particular. And we also draw on the best data we can. So we use the contemporary news media. We look at opinion surveys and attitude surveys. We do interviews. So we're doing interviews in each country, in each region. We're drawing on primary and secondary sources. So where other people have written, useful reports, such as the International Organization for Migration or other institutions, then we would draw very heavily on them. And clearly we would use data sources, and we'd use official data sources. We're not making up the data, but there are actually a number which Michael may want to explain, several alternative arrangements of the data, and we've used, and sometimes we have to try to reconcile data which doesn't look identical from different official data sources, but we do the best we can. Next. And then we've got a filter, which I think is a very useful one. It's something that we've borrowed from one of the most well-known textbooks on migration, and it's De Haas, Castles, and Miller. And the thing about migration policy is that what people say is not what people do, and what people do is not necessarily what the policies say either. So let's break that down a little bit. The public rhetoric about migration is often very conservative. When those conservative policies become presented as policies by government, say a white paper or a policy document of some kind, it may be slightly different from what people are saying. When those policies are translated into laws, those laws might be a little different from what the policies are. And we have some very obvious examples of policies that just haven't been implemented. In the South African case, which is the paper that I've written and will come out soon. And then, even though we have laws and regulations and institutions, the outcomes of those laws, regulations, and institutions aren't necessarily what they're supposed to be. So those are the gaps. The discursive gap is the gap between rhetoric and policy. The implementation gap is the gap between policy and laws and institutions. And the efficacy gap is the gap between those laws and institutions and the actual outcomes. And we found this an incredibly useful filter to help us think about migration governance. Next. So we have an interdisciplinary team. We have a legal scholar, that's Victor Amadi at the University of Cape Town. We have the political scientist, public admin expert, which is Raphael Leiter. We have the economist, and I called him number cruncher, politely, and that's Michael Mutava. And then, I mean, if I'm anything, I guess I'm more of a historian than anything else. I like lots of footnotes and lots of material to sift out and find the facts. So between us, we discuss the reports and we try to use our different skills to produce the best possible reports. And we also have an advisory board, which I haven't talked about, which is, and I don't have a slide for that, but it's a very eminent international advisory board from Africa and other parts of the world. Next. That advisory board goes through all of our papers before we publish them, although we take responsibility. In our original plan, apart from all the case studies, there were 3 introductory studies that we'd planned. The framework paper, which is now published, the trends paper, which is now published and which Michael will talk about. And Michael will only be able to look at the tip of the iceberg because it's a really big paper and interesting. We also wanted to do a paper on digitization and mobility of people. What the implications of... sorry, I overheard something. Somebody's not on mute. So the digitization paper, we looked quite hard. First, I went through my networks in the migration community, and then I went through my networks in the IT policy community, the digitization policy community. I just didn't end up with somebody who I thought was somebody who was in a position who had a real knowledge of both migration and digitization that could do the kind of project we wanted to. If anybody in the audience has suggestions, we'd be very keen to still follow up on that. So let's move on. So the progress we've made so far, the first 2 papers, the framing study, which I'm the primary author, and the trend study, which Michael's the primary author. We have 9 more to come, hopefully all by the end of next year. Nigeria, South Africa, Mozambique, Kenya, ECOWAS, EAC, SADC, the AU. And then at the end, a synthesis paper in which hopefully we will have actually made some sort of progress using all these cases and thinking about them, that we can make some quite comprehensive proposals around migration governance reform. I think that's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Alan. We're going to move over now to Michael. Michael, are you ready?
Yes, definitely.
Super. So Michael Matava is the author of this report, an applied economist with experience in trade, capital markets, and regional integration. He's a research fellow at the New South Institute. He studied at Kenyatta University in Kenya for his undergrad, and the University of Cape Town for his master's degree. He was the second runner-up at the 2016-2017 Capital Markets Inter-University competition in Kenya, which I'd love to find out what that even means. It sounds intimidating. He has worked for the government of Kenya through the Capital Markets Authority in product research and implementation of the CMA Master Plan. And I think, if I may, Michael, just before you start, I think what's so important and what's so surprising about this report is the degree to which its novelty lies in its compilation, as I understand it, largely for the first time, of diverse data on migration patterns on the African continent. So the fact that that work has never really been done in the kind of way in which you put it together now is, for me, rather surprising. And it does suggest a larger issue around the quality of analysis about and within the African continent, that often large statements are being made on very cursory or very idiosyncratic patches of information. So in this regard alone, this work has to be, in my mind, it has to be applauded just for the rigor of which you bring into the data collection process. So congratulations. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ivor, for those kind words. Can you hear me, Rafa? Okay.
Yeah,
Yes, just let me know when to skip the slides.
All right. Well, I would like to say that the motivation for this report really was just to bust the myths that are there on the continent. Just hold on, Rafa. We can just be on the first slide. I wanted to say the motivation for writing the report was because there was a lot of misinformation on the continent. When you listen to people speak and they say that African migrants are forever on Mediterranean boats to Europe, when you hear them say that in different countries in Africa, we probably have more migrants than even the natives, the migrants are supposed to even eclipse the population of the natives. When you hear people say there is probably a mass exodus, people are forever leaving Africa, that migration in Africa is actually treated as a pandemic, as malaria, as a disease. It's associated with, things that are not nice. So we wanted to just go deep and see what the data says, what the facts are, so that we just dispel some of those myths. We use data from UNDESA, and UNDESA obviously pulls a lot of the information from national census. So it is really, most of it is quite accurate data. And of course, we had challenges with some countries that don't file information, but we did some extrapolations there. I mean, most of that information is in the paper. So I will just go straight into the paper. We divided the regions, the entire continent really, into three main regions, the economic regions. That's East Africa Community, ECOWAS, and SADC. We had a residual region called the rest of Africa, just to take care of the other countries. And you will see why we did that. So we can go to the first slide, Rafa. So what we did first of all was to try and compare the level of migration in Africa with other parts of the world, other continents, and also very important, with other regions of economic development. So in both cases, we realized that the level of migration was quite low in terms of numbers and even in terms of percentages on the continent. By percentage, I mean the density of migrants. That's the number of migrants per particular number of the actual population. So you will realize that in Africa, we're probably at around below 2%, whereas in Northern America, in Europe, they're all above 10%. Asia is low, but the actual numbers are quite high. So that was that. And then in terms of comparing with regard to economic development, we found out that most regions that appear to have low income, they tend to have more immigrants than immigrants. More people tend to sort of move away than come in. And so because that is the profile of Africa, then it tells us then that Africa is a low income region. It's a low income region. Let's move to the next one. Yeah, just to demonstrate how little migration is going on in Africa, and just maybe to put away the first myth that we're having a lot of migrants in our individual countries. We're having the entire continent at around 1.89%. That's the migrant density, and then you can see that we have around 40 million that left this by 2020 and 25 million that came in. I should mention here then that when we say 40 million migrants are immigrants from the continent, it does not mean that 40 million migrants left the continent, because remember, the report says, or we say, that Africa is a continent of origin and destination. In actual numbers, 20.9 of them originated from Africa and ended up in Africa. When we say 25 million are immigrants to Africa, you must remember that those immigrants, 20.9 million are actually from Africa. And I will just get to the percentages below there. So those numbers give us a net of around 15 million that are immigrants. You must also not treat Africa as a small region. We're really a big region. So, in terms of the net figure, you should just compare it with all the regions. And you can see that most of sub-Saharan Africa actually does not have a huge net migration. Really, the greater portion of people leaving the continent are actually coming from that region we call rest of Africa, which has your Egypt, which has your Libya, which has Algeria and a lot of other North African countries, which also have a little bit of higher per capita. And this goes back to a previous slide where we looked at income, and higher income means a little bit of more migration. So that is, it should be very clear that Africa is not just a homogeneous region. There are differences depending on which part of Africa you're looking at. So this is quite clear, especially on the net figure. See that we're having net figures mostly from North Africa. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so again, people are not able to distinguish between origin and destination. When we're looking at Africa as an origin, that's when we're talking about the 40 million immigrants. So in the worst case scenario here, 52%, around those 20.9 million migrants end up within Africa, and the other half, probably, 48% thereabout, less than 52%. Are able to travel extracontinentally. But this is what I want you to pick from this slide, though. This migration by origin, you must ask yourself, where are Africans going? So if you look at sort of like the top 10 country destinations for these migrants, you will find Cote d'Ivoire there, you'll find South Africa, and the list is as it goes. But again, I just want to highlight that for the case of South Africa, it appears as a number 2 here, really, but it's number 1. We're looking at the origin as the world. So if you're talking about extracontinental migration, if you're looking at the world as an origin, people from also outside of the continent, South Africa leads. But because our focus is on African migration, Cote d'Ivoire is the first destination, followed by South Africa and Uganda, and the list goes down as it does. Next slide. If you look at Africa as a destination, if you have to go to your rival airports, this is the interesting bit now. You're going to discover that around 82% are just from movements within Africa. If you were to go to your airports, Africa is not so much of a favorite for international visitors, and by international I mean extracontinental. We're not that much popular, and this again is not surprising because our immigrant numbers should be higher than our immigrant numbers because of our income level. Okay, and again, if you look at the top countries of origin, now these are the people or the countries that are contributing a lot to the movement within Africa. Where are they coming from? When we say 82% are coming from Africa, from which specific countries? So you will be having South Sudan there, Burkina Faso, DRC, and the likes. The report will also show you when you talk about extracontinental migration, when you want to look at what are the origins when you're actually traveling outside of the continent. It shows that you will have Egypt as your number 1 country, and then you'll have Algeria somewhere in between there. Why? Because remember, when we talked about the rest of Africa, we had a lot of Northern African countries there, and they mostly send the migrants outside of the continent. So that's what you should pick from this slide. Next slide. Then we decided to look at the main regional as well as bilateral routes. So for regional, these are, which regions sort of have a lot of migrations between them. And this is where we get the idea that there's a lot of movement within the regions. We're calling it intra-regional because you can see the first one, there's ECOWAS to ECOWAS, then SADC to SADC, then EAC to EAC. So African migration is I want to say it happens a lot within the regions, basically. And then as you move down the list, you will see that there is moderate within region or between region movements, for example, between SADC and EAC and vice versa. For the case of regional and also for the case of bilateral movements, we also established that there is a lot of bi-directional movement. For example, if you look at the first route there, Burkina Faso to Cote d'Ivoire, down the list there you will find Cote d'Ivoire to Burkina Faso, and it is quite clear when you go deep within the regions, because this just looks at Africa as a general, but within the regions you'll find Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso. That's more within EAC and ECOWAS. Within SADC, you find that most of countries really have South Africa as a destination, so South Africa will tend to be to the right and not to the left. It forms some kind of an estuary when a river is pouring into an ocean. Most of the countries will be coming down there, but something else I want to highlight on these bilateral routes. We have a route down there somewhere in between, that is Somalia to Kenya. Okay, we also have another route that doesn't feature here, that is Nigeria to Cameroon. Most Nigerians, their first country of destination or the most popular is supposed to be Cameroon. Now, these two cases are interesting to us because Kenya and Somalia do not share sort of a regional grouping, something to Cameroon and Nigeria, and that leads us to believe that migration has an agency of its own. It has a mind of its own. If migrants have a reason to move, they will move. I think that was the conclusion that we were getting there, because now for a country like Kenya, the main migrants are coming from Somalia. So that is what came up from this slide. And then next, this is now a summary of the report. A lot of migration is happening within the continent. This shows that a lot of immigration and immigration from the regions are actually, majority of them, to other parts of the continent, except in one case, and we discussed that case, that is the rest of Africa. But every other region, they send most of the migrants to Africa, and they receive most of the migrants from Africa, except in one case, that is rest of Africa. And that is only in the immigrating case. They send most of the migrants extracontinentally, but of course they receive a lot from Africa. This scenario is mirrored within the country realities. You know, the countries we looked at, Nigeria, Kenya, Mozambique, South Africa, but there is a small difference here. The difference is in the immigration case. We find that Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa tend to send more people or more migrants outside of the continent. And this will go back to the first slides where we were talking about income. With higher levels of income, there is a tendency to sort of migration to increase. So this is quite clear, because Mozambique is not a very rich country, and you can see it's the only country that of the four that were considered, is the only country that appears to send more to Africa and also receive more from Africa. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the question goes back to the labor market a little bit. You know, a lot of migrants are in our countries and that kind of talk. Generally, the data shows that just under 3%, and this is for Africa. I know for the individual countries, this data has been aggregated from a few countries, and the report details the individual countries in there. You can go have a look. But on average, I mean, we only have 3% of the working group migrants being a percentage of all the working age migrants within the continent. And you can see that 55% are males and 45% are females, but that is unsurprising. Next. In terms of the labor force participation rate, I mean, this is also not surprising. A lot of literature confirms what we found, that migrants tend to have a higher labor force participation rate than the non-migrants. And this can be, of course, this paper was not going so much into policy and trying to explain what we see, but I mean, I want to speculate that this is because when you're away from home, the tendency to, you know, try to just make it work by all means tends to be a little bit higher. You will take up jobs that maybe the migrants are not, I mean, the non-migrants are not willing to take, you know, that kind of thing. So this is not unique to Africa, really. So a lot of migrants tend to have a higher labor force participation rate. Next slide. In terms of the economic sectors where migrants work, the data we had showed that a lot of them were working in the services sectors, you know, the hoteliers, the restaurants, the services, cleaning, that kind of thing. And then agriculture was second, and they were least found in industry. And then in terms of the level of education, and maybe this is something for policymakers to think about, we need to improve levels of education in order for migration to be more meaningful. Most of the migrants are basic or less than basic level of education, okay, in the data that we found. Next slide. Oh yeah, that was the end. Yeah, so this is what I wanted to say finally, that the data we used was quite useful because it was from UNDESA. So there is no way anybody should be able to say that, you know, this data is unavailable or not available. What I'm alluding to is the issue of saying legality. Do we have more legal migrants or do not have more legal migrants? You know, we have around 2.3 million migrants in the last 8 years that crossed the Mediterranean, but we're talking about 40 million migrants here that were registered leaving the continent. So most of the migration that happens is legal and not illegal. You know, those are just small percentages. Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Michael, thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. I think what is so striking in the end is that, and certainly disorienting. I think there's so many prejudices around the character of migration on the African continent, but also about who those migrants are. And that last slide of yours is quite fascinating, that often one thinks of the migrants as those with greater means. And you suggested that earlier in the slide, but it turns out that migrants on the African continent are largely those with very basic means and very low levels of education. So that certainly does, and I wonder how that relates to larger global patterns. So something worth thinking about. I'd like to introduce our first discussant, if I can. Diego Utaralde, forgive my pronunciation there.
Sorry,
Diego,
sorry, it's Tyson now. Sorry, you just confused. Sion is first. Yeah.
Beg your pardon. I'm going to ask. I want to ask Tan to introduce herself a little bit. Tell us a little bit about herself. I always find that nice if someone I don't know is new to me. So Tan, please will you say something about who you are and how you relate to this project? We look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Reba. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Excellent. Good afternoon, all. My name is Sion Tadessa Bebe. I work as a senior policy and research officer in the IOM Regional Office for Eastern Horn of Africa in Nairobi. I publish a lot on migration and displacement issues. Free movement of persons, regional integration is some of the areas I published. Recently, I led the State of Migration in Eastern Horn of Africa report, a major flagship report published by IOM's East Africa Community and IGAD. So I end introducing myself here and would like to continue, Reba, with my few reflections. Is that fine?
Sure.
So first of all, I would like to thank the New South Institute for inviting me to share my perspectives here. And I would like to congratulate the Institute also for launching this important program, Migration Governance Reform in Africa Research Program. The fact that I really want to emphasize, this program aims to map viable pathways for improving the ease of movement and settlement by Africans across Africa borders is a very important objective, since Africa's regional integration, including the free movement of persons, holds huge potential for Africa's socioeconomic development. And I would also like to congratulate Alan and Michael for the publication of these two important papers, which we are discussing today. And in terms of my reflection, I would like to focus on two issues. One, key insights of these papers to advance Africa's free movement of persons agenda, and two, gaps. The two papers point to different important insights to advance the free movement of persons in Africa. But for this particular session, I want to focus on three of them. The role of bilateral agreements in advancing regional mobility is one of them. Second, the importance of sub-regional free movement arrangements in facilitating mobility. And finally, the need to pay attention to education systems in the context of labor mobility, exactly due to the reasons highlighted by Michael earlier. The role of bilateral agreements in advancing regional mobility is one of the key issues discussed in both papers. And in this respect, the experience of SADC is quite interesting, as it has seen the second highest regional movement following ECOWAS, although its draft protocol on facilitation of movement of persons hasn't seen the light of ratification. These movements are happening because countries in the region have been removing visa requirements on bilateral basis and also trying to negotiate for labor arrangements, as rightly discussed in the papers. A similar trend is also seen in the East African context that complements the existing common market protocol of the East African community. In this regard, the experiences of Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda is cited in the Trendes paper. And additional recent developments we have seen in this region is Kenya's signing free movement regimes visa waiver with Eritrea and Djibouti. The trend of bilateral agreements can be important to watch because it can be used as the first step to address the challenges facing the Continental Free Movement of Persons Protocol, including the aspects of sovereignty and trust building, which are discussed in the Trends chapter in the Trends paper as one of the critical challenges. Showing the value of free movement of persons at a small scale, it could encourage states to consider expanding free movement regimes arrangements with more countries. The importance of sub-regional free movement arrangements in facilitating mobility is another important aspect discussed in the Trends paper. The experience of ECOWAS and East African Community is important here, as both have ratified free movement arrangements under implementation. In this respect, the paper indicates that 93% of the 1.3 million immigrants in Nigeria in 2020 came from other ECOWAS countries. 60% of the 1.7 million Nigerian immigrants migrated to other ECOWAS countries. The East African Community is also witnessing growth in number of migrants, which can be due to the implementation of its Common Market Protocol, which came into force in the last decade. Because of these developments, regionalization is indicated as the most salient pattern in African migration in the paper. And this confirms that regional economic communities can play a critical role in enhancing Africa's free movement of persons agenda if they have the free movement frameworks in place and have also member states that take an interest on the issue. The important role of education in determining sectors of employment of migrants is another important issue I want to highlight. According to the Trends paper and highlighted by Michael earlier, in 2020, there were 20.3 million working age migrants in Africa, although they accounted for only 3% of the working age population of the continent. One of the points discussed in the paper, which I found quite important to watch, is the fact that most of the migrant workers have a basic or less than basic education. Only a small percentage have advanced education. If we take the case of Cote d'Ivoire, for example, only 1% of the migrant workers had advanced education, while 73% required less than basic education. This really determines where they are going, half of them working in the service sector, 40% in the agricultural sector. This points to the importance of paying attention to the national education systems to reap the benefits of regional mobility, particularly labor mobility, especially in the context where in 2030, Africa is expected to become home to the world's largest workforce in the world with a working age population of over 600 million. There is one major gap I would like to highlight with respect to the Trends paper. That is the limited coverage of African labor mobility trends. As rightly indicated in the paper, a prominent feature of African migration is economic migration. Labor mobility is one of such movements and holds a central place. However, the Trends paper only offers some general perspectives on labor mobility in Africa without shedding light on the critical role of the context of Africa's integration agenda, free movement of persons landscape, and how they relate to labor mobility. As we all know, the right to work is central to the continental and sub-regional free movement of persons frameworks, and labor mobility is also one of the 8 pillars of the African migration policy framework for Africa. If the paper applied a similar analysis framework used for the key migration trends analysis it presented, that is using the selected sub-regions such as ECOWAS, the East African Community, and SADC, and the selected countries, to analyze the labor migration landscape, it could have even made better contributions. This could help the paper to capture important ongoing work in the continent by the African Union and RICS towards advancing mutual recognition of qualifications, the skills, as well as portability of social security benefits, which are critical to advance labor mobility interregionally. This is in addition to the increased number of migrants workers we are seeing in the sub-regions. In the Eastern Horn of Africa region, for example, we have seen a steady growth in the number of migrant workers from 2.5 million to 4.7 million between 2010 and 2019. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize the importance of research in providing valuable policy inputs towards advancing Africa's free movement of persons agenda, which is critical to the aspiration of regional integration. Indeed, both papers point to important contributions towards mapping viable pathways for improving the ease of movement of Africans across African borders. And I really look forward to reading the rest of the upcoming papers, the 9 papers under the program. Again, congratulations to Alan and Michael, and thank you. Back to you, Reva.
And Ms. Abeba, thank you so much for those comments and critical comments too. I think it's very important that these spaces are also spaces of critical engagement. So thank you very much for those comments, and I'll leave those to Alan and Michael to respond to. The final distinguished member of the panel is Diego Uteralde. Diego, I want to ask you also to introduce yourself, Chief Director, Demography and Population Statistics at Stats South Africa, and a whole lot of great accomplishments as well. So over to you, Diego.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Diego Uteralde. I'm Chief Director for Demography and Population Statistics at Stats SA, as was mentioned. I've had the privilege to work with the UN expert group on international migration statistics in terms of reconceptualizing migration, and I'm going to make some reference to that later on, but also been involved in the other structures such as the IDAC, which is about children on the move with UNICEF, and as well as closer to home, the specialized technical group on international migration with the African Union. I'm going to make my comments in 3 parts. First part that I would like to focus on is the issue of definitions. I think it's really important that if we speak about migration, we should have an understanding what we are speaking about. I noticed there was one question in the chat around that, and the paper on migration governance also makes some references to issues of definitions. So because the expert group, which I just mentioned, was one that I chaired from 2018 to 2022, and it submitted its work to the UN Statistics Commission in 2021. I'd like to share that with you, and that's that the new conceptual framework and the definitions of international migration to define international migration are such that it reflects movement with a change in the place of usual residence. And usual residence in turn is defined in line with the principles and recommendations of population censuses from the United Nations as a place where you reside for at least 6 months and 1 day within a 12-month period, or where you reside for a full 12 months that does not include absences for work assignments or holidays. So that's how we define a migrant. Furthermore, the expert group also distinguishes between migrants who are those who meet the threshold of 6 or 12 months, and temporary residents who do not meet this threshold, but who enter the country for a variety of reasons, which may include cross-border internal displacement, which I put in inverted commas. That's the first part that I wanted to raise, was the issue of what a definition is. I think that similar to migration governance frameworks, there are statistical frameworks and developmental frameworks as well. And of course, the SDG is one such globally agreed developmental framework that we all subscribe to. And within this, migration for the first time plays a really key role, particularly compared to the Millennium Development Goals, which where migration was completely silent. In addition to the various indicators in the SDGs related to migration, there is also the African Union's Vision 2063, which makes reference to migration, but also the IOM and its partners are putting together indicators to inform us of the implementation of the Global Compact on migration. So that is a process that is still underway. There is still a lot of consultation that will take place with regards to that. But I'd like to think that by this time next year, we will have a series of statistical indicators that we can recommend to countries to collect in order to see where do we stand with regards to the implementation of the Global Compact as a best practice guideline of migration governance. Then of course, there are also there's the issue of disaggregation for all of these frameworks, whether it be age, sex, or disability status. These are the key to ensure that nobody is left behind. And it's really important amongst this disaggregation for migration indicators that we disaggregate to sub-national level and up to and including local government level, because this is where the main challenges of migration governance take place. And this is where a lot of the capacity building is required. So I'd like to perhaps focus now on some thoughts around that particular point, and that is about the impact of migration and migration governance at local level. And I think it's fair to say that any discussion about migration governance often has the impact at local level, where the authorities need to react to and respond to the needs to provide services to migrants, and in some cases, unauthorized migrants. Any reform of African migration governance needs to take into account the type of reform and the impact that this will have on local governments and its communities, which I think Alan made reference to. The availability of data as well as its interpretation is critical for policy development from an evidence-based perspective, which is really the main thrust of the message that I want to push through this afternoon. Very often, data is misinterpreted, or it's dismissed when we do not agree with popular rhetoric, and hence not considered in the development of policy. There's also a lack of appreciation into the processes that one needs to take on board to produce data, and especially so at the local level. As an example, on the issue of resource allocation to local government, it must be stressed that the local government equitable share that is administered by the National Treasury, the case of South Africa, uses official data that is inclusive of all people who live in local municipalities. And very often the perception is that unauthorized migrants are not budgeted for in this process, which is not true. Then finally, some of the efforts to provide empirical data at the local level can be met through administrative records, amongst other sources, but the capacity to produce these at the local level and then to share them with the National Statistics Office is something that is currently lacking. So then I think finally, I just want to maybe share some thoughts about migration in Africa. What are some of the thoughts and trends that we see? And I think many of them, which I will mention, are thoughts that Michael's already made reference to. And that is, for example, that by and large, most migration in Africa is intra-regional, if not intra-African. And much of the movement is developmental by using it as a strategy to escape from poverty, conflict, unemployment, and more recently, environmental factors. All regions are beneficiaries of remittances by either sending to family members or receiving from a migrant family, especially in countries with large populations and large migrant stocks. These result in large volumes of remittances, which are significant for local economies and for targeting assistance to specific individuals. Then focusing a little bit on internal migration. This is a part of migration which is very dominant, particularly due to the large urban centers, which can be a springboard to further migration. In Southern Africa, however, there is a very fluid circular migration between rural and urban centers. In terms of internal and cross-border displacement, much of this has been previously and historically conflict-driven, and it still is. However, more and more these days is due to environmental reasons such as desertification and climate change. Investment in agriculture is also a challenge in a continent that is not water secure. And in this light, issues of agriculture, water, gender, and migration are closely intertwined. I have mentioned that conflict and political instability are reasons for displacement. These are also the reasons behind the many refugees who reside within the continent from people originating from within the continent itself. From a governance standpoint, although some regions have free movement agreements, coordination related to governance is still sorely lacking between countries. Then the dominant narrative, as Michael indicated in his introduction, was that movement was about African movement to Europe, but it has already been mentioned that a lot of the movement is intra-regional and intra-African, and with a matter of fact, movement to Europe being on the decline since 2019. And it's worth noting that 5 of the top 10 countries taking advantage of the assisted voluntary return and reintegration processes are countries within West Africa. I think the report also made a lot of reference to issues of labor migration. We know that globally, labor migration makes up more than half of all migratory moves. And this too is an important part for us to invest in terms of data collection and informing policy of the proportions of foreign-born people who are active in the labor market. So finally, just in closing, to say that the success of migration governance and measurement is down to it being an all-of-government and all-of-society approach. And this approach underscores that migration is a multidimensional reality that needs to be addressed through multi-stakeholder partnerships. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much Diego. Thank you very much for those comments. I think we've got a lot. I think it's a very rich series of presentations. I think I'm going to hand back to Alan and to Michael for comments. We're in quite good time, even though we've had 4 presentations. We've still got half an hour. So back to Alan and Michael, depending on how quickly you can respond to what's been said. We can move on. We can open up for a round of questions. Just in terms of the NSI's focus, NSI are very much interested in institutions, its relationship to democratization and strengthening and protecting democracy. But our focus really is on institution building. We do a lot of work on public administrations. And the question I would have for Michael and for Alan and the team more broadly is going forward around the detailed questions around migration management in terms of border controls, the institutions that are actually regulating institutions, not from a legislative point of view or regulatory point of view, but the actual institutions of border control, the guards on borders, the fences, the instruments which are being used to control and manage how that happens. It'd be very interesting to see how that differs or is the same across the continent and between countries. But on that note, Michael and Alan, I think over to you.
Thanks, Ivor, and thank you very much to Sion and Diego for excellent contributions. You know, we were very excited that they were able to join us in this conversation, because they are really important contributors to the conversation in Africa and more broadly. Just in response to Ivor's question, so I have a quote from Etienne Balibar in my paper, which says, borders are everywhere and nowhere. And essentially what Balibar means is that the enforcement of migration takes place at the borders, but also at many other places. So it takes place in terms of access to jobs, access to residential facilities, access to social security, access just to legality. In Africa, the management of borders has made quite considerable advances in many parts, particularly in the sort of northern half of Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in parts of West Africa, partly due to huge injections of money from the European Union and other funders, and partly for perhaps, you know, bad reasons, in the sense that for the European Union, the main concern is to prevent the excessive flow of people in a northerly direction. Not that this is a very significant number. And just to get back to some of the numbers Diego was talking about, I've got some other nice numbers from the OECD. Of the top 20 countries of seeking asylum in OECD countries, in the rich countries, of the top 20 countries seeking asylum in the OECD countries, not a single country is an African country. So African countries come quite far down in the list of in terms of volume of people seeking asylum. So the people crossing the Mediterranean are of symbolic importance, but they're much less significant numerically than other migrations that are happening in terms of asylum. And then if we just look at people who've changed their nationalities or people who've adopted new nationalities in the OECD countries, only 2 African countries come into the top 20. Those are Nigeria and Morocco. So we're not big players in international migration, either for asylum or through the regular channels. But okay, so to get back to so that's, I think, why the EU has, well, one of the reasons why the EU has put a lot of money into it. The African Development Bank and the Economic Commission for Africa, the International Organization for Migration, all play a really significant role at an operational level in helping countries develop better systems of civil registration, of passport issuing, of electronic border control systems. So even some of the poorer countries in Africa are able to adopt some of the modern systems with the assistance of international organizations. So I don't think we should underestimate the progress that Africa is making at this time, even though there is a way to go. So, you know, I think that some of the anxiety about migration in some of the richer African countries, whether it's North Africa, Southern Africa, or West Africa, some of the anxiety that people coming into the country may not have the kind of quality of documentation that is required, that perhaps their own, the countries that they come from don't have the right kind of systems of criminal records or intelligence about terrorism or whatever it is. There's an element of truth in that, but it's not the overwhelming. Most countries are now developing much better systems with the assistance of many international organizations. So Sion's contribution, I think, you know, that's something that we've emphasized, the multiple ways in which reform is taking place, bilateral, regional. She talked about the regional economic communities, even sub-regional. Within economic communities, there are groups that are getting together that are making faster progress than the other countries in those regional communities, and they're encouraging effectively the others to follow suit. And the best known example is in East Africa, where Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda allow people to move across borders with civil registration documentation, ID documents only. And they're also improving access of people across those borders to jobs. And that's moving more quickly than the other members of the East African community, such as Burundi or Tanzania, South Sudan. But I think that they will move in the direction sooner or later. So that's at a bilateral level. Even South Africa has moved quite significantly. We recently signed a bilateral agreement with Ghana, so we don't need visas going to Ghana. A little while ago with Kenya, we don't need visas going to Kenya, and for most of our neighbors, we don't need visas, and hopefully that will continue. Even though the recent white paper, draft white paper on migration in South Africa is very disturbing in many respects, it doesn't mean that we won't continue to improve our bilateral relationships with other parts of Africa. And the other points Sion made are really good. I think the need for mutual recognition agreements on educational accreditation systems and those sort of things are really important in Africa to make it easier for people to move and work in other African countries, perhaps first at a regional level and then at a continental level. Both Diego and Sion talked about migrant workers and Michael's numbers about the significant proportion of relatively low educated people who do migrate. So the way that many countries handle that, the way that South Africa has handled that historically has been through what are almost, infamously called bilateral labor agreements. Bilateral labor agreements, especially in the historical South African style, have been agreements which say, people can come from, say, Mozambique to South Africa, work on the mines, go back after 11 months. They have no rights to long-term residence. They have no rights to social security. They have no rights to all kinds of social provisions. Those are very sort of antiquated forms of bilateral labor agreements. There are more modern bilateral labor agreements that are being developed globally. And perhaps some of the most interesting ones are in countries like some countries in the Middle East, but particularly Canada is leading the way in terms of the way that it manages its relationships with relatively low-skilled migrants who work on farms and similar kinds of activities. So there's a lot that Africa and some African countries can learn about how to manage the movement of low-skilled or relatively low-skilled migrants more effectively. And there'll be a lot in my South Africa paper and in the other papers coming out as we go along the way. Yeah, I'm interested in Diego telling us how easy it is going to be to operationalize the definitions that they've come up with. Are we, when are we going to actually be able to get the data that we can use those much more refined definitions than the ones that we've been able to use for now? Because it requires information that is not available, not as easily available. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Alan. Michael, is there anything you want to add?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So I just want to also, just echo a few comments from Alan. I realized Sion was talking about we should have gone more in depth in terms of the labor mobility. And, I just want to throw the ball back to her because she works with, IOM, and there is a way that maybe she has more influence on the powers that be to ensure that we have a better way of collecting data probably on the continent with the AU, because there is a data set that the AU presumably maintains, but it is not readily available, the Statafric data set. And in this place, they sort of keep data, but it's not also aggregated. In fact, a lot of countries don't have their data there. It's nil. You will realize that as opposed to dividing the countries into the regions, ECOWAS, SADC, and EAC, in the labor section, we were highlighting the specific countries. Why? Because it's better to look at the countries from which data was aggregated, because they are not probably a lot to just throw them there and not worry about the individual countries. So that's what I wanted to say with regard to the labor mobility. But Ivo, you raised a few concerns which Alan has addressed, and I just want to echo some of his sentiments. First of all, free migration doesn't mean free migration, because I get that a lot of people almost feel like now free migration then means that our countries are open, just like windows or an open door. You just move in and out, But free migration is we're referring to documented or regulated. That means that at the borders you get checked, you get documented. When we say that Kenya has open borders, we want all the Africans to fly visa free to Kenya. At the border, at least we need to, even if you're coming in with an ID, you need to be recorded that we have this number of foreigners in our country. And we're able then to track miscreants and people who are doing bad things, because if people who mean bad things, for example, criminals, can get into a country in this era of let me call it, in this period where there's no free movement, then even in the period or in the era or period where we have free movement, they will still be able to get in, because I can guarantee you they do not use official borders. They probably just going through some parts and bits of the borders that are porous, are not regulated, they will just find ways to get in. So the point really is to encourage regulated migration. So that's what I wanted to say. But again, the other thing, or the greater thing that we must understand is migration is the norm. It's the social process. It's what happens. It's not the exception. It's not the exception. I think we almost feel like we're trying to create an allowance for migration, but it's not. It's what always happens. Okay. If you look at Alan's paper, it's very interesting. He argues how the development of the European single market, the European Union, since the inception in 1957, the European Union, how they address the free movement of people. First of all, it's called the four freedoms: the freedom of movement of persons, of goods, of services, and of capital. You see, first of all, even the phrasing, four freedoms, almost gives it a sense of a right, okay? And in 1986, true to the word, they enshrined that the right to move in the European Charter of Human Rights. That shows that it is the norm. It is something that will always happen, okay? So that we should encourage a lot more migration. But then what about the guards that you're talking about? Those are attempts to sort of stifle migration, First of all, illegal migration or any kind of migration, first of all, begins legally, because you will put guards at the border. But in most cases, when I think of coming to South Africa, when I think of coming to Kenya, when I think of going to Rwanda, because it's a foreign country, the first thing I have to do is to try and go there legally as a tourist, as a student, for example. And my visa expires after 2 years, and I decide I am not now going to renew. I stay there as an illegal migrant. So you see, you might put a lot of controls even at the borders, but most of these things don't even happen at the borders. And then the other thing, trying too much to stifle migration has an underlying stomach that is not so nice. This has been shown by the example of Mexico migrants to the US, and also the example of migrants in North Africa, Morocco to Spain. So you'll realize that when the US decides that, we're going to put a lot of bottlenecks for Mexicans, Mexicans now move into the US, and because they know it's not easy to get in back in the US, they stay there. They spoil or they interfere with the fundamental, with the process of migration as a regular process. There's what they call a circular flow, that people just come in and go, come in and go. Now you find that they just want to stay in the US and not even come back to Mexico. You're exacerbating the situation. That is the same case that happened between Morocco and Spain. A while back, you didn't need a visa to go to Spain from Morocco, and then they introduced it. So what happened? As Morocco, small populations of Moroccans began to sprout in Spain and other parts of Europe. Why? Because now you're encouraging people to actually come in by whatever means. Why? Because migration has its own agency. If they see a need, they will find a way to go. So they come in by whatever means and just now settle or establish themselves. In my paper, we look at the distribution of ages, and we realize throughout the paper, we indicate that migrants, the age structure tends to have a right tail or a right skew. And, the implication is that we have fewer older migrants. Part of the reason could be that we have a lot of people that are, not a lot, could be that they are dying, naturally, natural attrition through death. But the other main reason, which I suspect, right, really, is that we have what we call remigration in Africa. You'll find that Africans are the sort of people who, they will migrate, and then the moment they feel like they have enough money to go back and invest at home, they go back home. Or when they feel like they want to retire, they go retire back at home. So even the social pains that we probably attribute to those migrants is not necessarily true. They give the best years of their working ages, and then as they grow older, they have to go back and reinvest back at home, or so to speak, like an African, they say, I want to be buried at home. So it's a process. It must not be seen as a silo that we are going to stop migration. We must find ways to integrate, like Diego said, a multi-dimensional view of managing migration, So I hope I've answered some of your concerns, Ivan. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We are running out of time. I think we're almost at the end, actually. We've got a few more minutes. So maybe I could just, for further conversation going forward, I'm not going to open it up because otherwise we're going to go over. Just to thank everybody. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Diego. And thank you, Tiana Bebe, for your comments. The chat board has been full of recommendations, Alan and Michael, about further pieces of research that you might have to look at, and other sources potentially for your work. We do have 4 questions on the panel, which I'm going to put out there. I'm not going to ask you to respond to because we've run out of time. The one is around disaggregating what's driving migration, which I think some discussion should be paid attention to. One is the degree to which conflict is driving migration on the African continent. So those trends that you were describing, well, to what extent are they driven by conflicts and wars in various areas? The other one is to what extent is it driven by climatological factors, climate collapse, heating, rainfall, storms, etc., in particular areas. Someone wanted to know about migration to the Gulf states. That's how important that is. And then, if you'll forgive me, someone asked if the AFCFTA is helping. I'm not quite sure what they meant by helping. Perhaps you'll have a better sense of, but something whether that institution is playing a role. We've still got a few more minutes. Does anybody want to add a question in that regard, which Michael and Alan can take forward? I'm not going to ask them to respond to it unless there's something urgent they want to say in concluding. Are there any further comments or questions which you have for Alan and Michael, and for the respondents as well, for them to take forward, go into further discussions or pieces of work? If not, I'm going to ask Michael and Alan within literally a minute each to add some final concluding words. And then I'm going to bring the session to an end. And maybe Diego and Tion, if you have some final remarks as well. So a minute to everybody. And then I'm going to conclude. So Alan, Michael.
Can I go first?
Yes, and Michael, a minute, literally.
Okay, so I mean, there's a lot of, there's data regarding the Gulf states and that kind of thing, but I mean, it wasn't necessarily our interest at this moment. I just want to comment on the AFTA. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, for it to work, we need free movement of people. And I will give you very clear examples. For example, the main sending country for migrants to Kenya is Somalia. And we don't like that relationship between Kenya and Somalia, but the value of exports of Kenya to Somalia is in excess of $120 million US. This is as at 2021 because our data ends at 2020. If you look at the main receiving country for Kenya is Uganda, and then Uganda happens to be our biggest trading partner. This is not a coincidence. There is frosty relationship between South Africa and Zimbabwe, but South Africa exports in excess of $3 billion US as at 2021 of goods to Zimbabwe. The same can be shown between Nigeria and Cameroon. The same can be shown between the value of exports from Nigeria to South Africa. It's quite a lot. This is not a coincidence. There is a clear nexus between trade and free movement of people. So that is my message.
Thanks, Michael. Alan?
Yeah, I'll just add to Michael and say that in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, in the protocol for the trade in services, there is a specific reference to the need to find a way to enable people who provide services and business people to move across the continent. And that's a very interesting dimension, because what we found in South America and in Europe, that continental systems for the freer movement of relatively skilled people actually paved the way for the development of the systems for all people. I can't go into that in detail, but I encourage people to read my rather long paper if they want to find out more about that. But I do think that there is a policy coincidence between the free movement process and the free trade process that's very important. And in fact, it was the central focus of the recent Pan-African Forum on Migration, which took place in Gaborone.
Tian, sorry, I was on mute. Tian, do you have a last comment, perhaps?
Thank you, Reba. Yeah, one quick comment related to borders. According to the findings of our recently published report, The State of Migration in East and Horn of Africa, border management is an enabler of the movement of people, goods, and services, and a catalyst for regional integration. And the adoption of the EAC Common Passport in this region is the strongest manifestation of this act. And finally, the one-stop border posts we have in this region demonstrate the promise and potential of the integrated border management in advancing human mobility. And on the promise of the link between trade and human mobility, I want to emphasize that the one-stop border posts originally were put in place to facilitate the movement of goods, but now they are forced to facilitate the movement of people as well. And as we speak now, they have reduced the waiting time from 90 days to 30 minutes in many cases. Thank you, over.
That's 30 minutes. I was thinking with the situation in South Africa crossing the border into Mozambique, I now see it's 34 days if you're a truck. So that's quite astonishing. Diego, last minute to you. You have the last word in the session.
Thank you so much. Just two comments. One almost in response to Alan's comment about the definition. I think it's a noted point that is being made. However, if a definition is not going to include a criteria for time, then it becomes very difficult to determine which person who has crossed the border becomes a migrant. You may have somebody who's coming to attend a meeting for a week. Is that person a migrant? So it's really important to have a time criteria, and that's what the definition is attempting to do by talking about usual residence and by talking about a threshold that's related to the 12-month period. Then Michael made some comments about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Saturday was African Statistics Day, and the theme of Africa Statistics Day this year is about using innovative statistical techniques, artificial intelligence and the like, to implement the African Free Trade Agreement. But I want to agree with Michael and say that products do not trade with each other, people do. And in order for this to become a success, in order for the implementation of this agreement to be successful, we need to, from a policy side and from a measurement perspective, be able to facilitate the movement of people from one country to the other, and to put a value on what that free but regulated movement is able to achieve. I thank you.
On that note, I'm going to bring this webinar to an end. Thank you very, very much. We had a lovely turnout. So we had nearly 60 people, and right to the end, we've had a lot of people staying right to the end. Again, thank you to the discussants for joining us. Thank you to Alan and thank you for Michael. Going forward, if I may make an announcement, we have a new major report on public service reform, which is just being completed, and which we will launch soon, including a policy brief. And very exciting to wait for a major new study of the framework of the New South itself. So conceptualizing the idea of the New South, which will come out as well, perhaps before the end of the year or early next year. On that note, thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you to Alan. Thank you for Michael for important work. Goodbye to everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Moment. I'm checking the comments.
Hi, Michael. I can send you the comments and the video, the recording of the session afterwards.
Cool. Sorry, you're able to look at me. Oh my God, Rafael, you're a wizard.
We were looking at you.
Don't worry.
Oh my goodness.